Sometimes God can ask us to do things that don't make sense to us. I've seen it with my own eyes. This is the story of my friend Daniel and the woman who almost missed a blessing because she doubted God's plan. Daniel was a remarkable man, though he was poor and walked with a limp because of a childhood illness. His love for God shone brightly. He was educated, but life was hard, and he earned a small income tutoring children in the village. He never complained though. Even every day, I saw him in church, lifting his hands in worship and praying for God's will in his life. But if I'm honest, Daniel wasn't the kind of man most women would notice. He didn't have money nor status. That's why what happened with Grace was so shocking. Grace was beautiful, educated, and came from a wealthy family in the city. She had come to our village to visit her grandmother. Everyone admired her, and many young men tried to get her attention, but Grace seemed focused on her career and her big city dreams. One day, after a church service, Grace came to me looking troubled. She said, Baba Esther, I had a strange dream last night. In the dream, I heard a voice say, Marry Daniel. But how can this be? Daniel is poor. And she hesitated, but I knew what she was thinking. She didn't want to say that Daniel's limp made him less desirable in her eyes. I smiled and said, My daughter, God's plan don't always look like ours. If he has spoken, then there is a reason. But Grace shook her head. It doesn't make sense, Baba. I can't do it. I've worked so hard to build my life. How can I throw it away by marrying someone who has nothing to offer me? From that day, Grace tried to forget the dream. She went back to the city and even started dating someone else, a rich, charming man named Chuka. She thought she could run from God's instruction, but God, oh, God has his ways. Grace told me later that every time she prayed, Chuka's name would fade from her heart, and she would hear Daniel's name instead. Even when she tried to focus on work, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was disobeying God. One day, during her quiet time, she said she heard God's voice again. Grace, I have chosen Daniel for you. Trust me. This time she couldn't ignore it. She returned to the village, trembling with uncertainty. When she told me she had decided to obey God, I was filled with joy and said, You won't regret this, my daughter. God's plans are always perfect. I will never forget the look on Daniel's face when Grace told him, she said, Daniel, I don't fully understand this, but God has told me to marry you. Daniel stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then he smiled, a smile filled with joy and humility, and said, Grace, I have prayed for a wife who loves God above all else. I know he said he is sending my wife to me, but if God has spoken to you, then I accept his will. It wasn't a grand proposal or a big celebration, but it was the beginning of something beautiful. Their simple wedding ceremony in the village with a few family members and friends gathered. The couple looks humble but peaceful as they exchanged vows. The wedding was small and simple, but she could feel God's presence. Grace looked nervous, but there was also a quiet strength in her eyes. She had chosen to obey, even when it didn't make sense. After they got married, life wasn't easy. They lived in Daniel's tiny one room house. and money was tight. Grace had to adjust from a life of comfort to a life of simplicity. But through it all, she stood by her husband and trusted God's plan. Then, slowly but surely, things began to change. One day, an old schoolmate of Daniel's came to the village. He was now a successful businessman and had been looking for someone trustworthy to manage his new company. When he heard about Daniel, he offered him the job immediately. Daniel prayed about it, and after he got a confirmation from the Lord, he accepted the offer. The salary was more than anything Daniel had ever dreamed of. They moved to the city, and within months, their lives were transformed. Grace started a small business, which quickly grew because of her hard work and determination. Before long, Daniel's limp, which he had lived with for years, was also healed after a successful surgery funded by his new employer. The man who once struggled to make ends meet now walked confidently, both physically and spiritually. Daniel and Grace in their beautiful city home, hosting a Bible study with friends, with joy filling the room. But the best part, Grace told me that through it all, her love for Daniel grew stronger every day. She said, Baba Esther, I almost missed my blessing because I was looking with my human eyes. But God saw Daniel's heart and how now I see it too. I love him more than I ever thought possible. But God truly knows best. Their story became a testimony that inspired many others. People in the village and in the city marveled at how God had transformed their lives. And Grace, she always said, when you obey God, He never fails. My brothers and sisters, sometimes God's instructions don't make sense to us, but His thoughts are higher than ours, and His plans are always for our good. Grace and Daniel's story is proof that obedience to God brings blessings beyond what we can imagine. So, if God is asking you to do something today, trust Him. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11. If this story blessed you, please like, share, and subscribe. Let someone else know that God's plans are always perfect. God bless you.